On February 24, 2022, Europe was shocked by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Soon, more than 800 journalists from all over the globe went there to broadcast the situation on the ground in what has rapidly become the fastest exodus crisis in Europe since World War II. This is not the first time that media attention focuses on a concrete situation of crisis, such as, for example, summer 2021 in Afghanistan, the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar in 2017, and the so-called refugee crisis as a result of the Syrian war in 2015. These conflicts have been covered by the media with different degrees of interest and impact. In some of them, migrants and refugees have been portrayed as victims, while in others, they have been portrayed as a threat. In some cases, such as in Ukraine, the focus has been put on the solidarity with these people, while in others, media attention has focused on the potential problems arising from these arrivals. Why has that happened? What are the differences between the narratives used to explain the case of Ukraine versus other migration crises? How do those different stories affect the response to those situations? How do different interpretations lead to different policies? As you can see, we have many unresolved questions. Our table of experts and journalists will try to shed some light on this. Are you on board?
This program is part of the BRIDGES podcast series produced by the Barcelona Centre for International Affairs and funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 program.
Thank you very much for joining us today in the first podcast of the BRIDGES project. My name is Mar Sabé Dausà, and I am happy to welcome you in this discussion that will lead, I'm sure, to very interesting reflections. The topic cannot be more up-to-date: the narratives on migration. How do we explain migration? What are the consequences of those stories? To start sharing some context, I'm pleased to introduce Ferruccio Pastore, the BRIDGES scientific co-coordinator and director of FIERI, which stands for the Forum Internazionale et Europeo di Ricerca sull'Immigrazione. Did I say it all right?
Perfect. Wow.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ferruccio, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Mar. Yes, we have been researching the production and reception of migration narratives for over a year now with our CIDOB colleagues and other colleagues in the BRIDGES project. We've been collecting a lot of materials, but there is one striking, overarching finding that I would like to start from, and which was not totally unexpected, but still is striking us. In carrying out research in 6 different countries over written media, social media, TV, and the finding is that migration narratives are crafted by non-migrants based on information provided by non-migrants, addressing a public of non-migrants, essentially. So it's a conversation led by natives, among natives, for natives. And it's a conversation in which certain categories, primarily politicians, play a central role. Using migration as a tool, or even you could say often as an emotional weapon. It is as if you were covering football without ever talking to players or even to coaches, but only to the public or to the owners of the clubs. And in this sense, we are getting a strong confirmation that migration narratives are not only about migration, are not probably mainly about migration, or sometimes they're not about migration at all. They're about us, they're about power, they're about consensus and what keeps together our societies. This is a striking, although, as I said, not totally unexpected finding. We could ask, and we ask, why is this the case? We think it's a complicated answer. It's not just about silencing migrant voices. Of course, this may happen, but this is not the main thing. It's probably more complex than this. There is an issue of dismissal of the very possibility that migrants can have a meaningful voice in the debate that can go beyond mere human witnessing of their own subjective personal experience. So there are structural factors that explain this paradoxical lack of voice, and among which, for instance, the lack of representation of migrants among journalists, which is one of the issues, but maybe András and May will be able to tell more on this.
Thank you very much, Ferruccio, for the presentation of the project. Now is the time to welcome the participants for the panel that are here with us today. I'm happy to introduce you to May Bulman. She is the Social Affairs Correspondent at The Independent. She has years of experience covering migration, modern slavery, youth justice, and homelessness. Her job has been awarded several times, and she came runner-up to the investigative journalism on the Drum Online Media Awards for her refugee coverage in 2017. Welcome on board, May. It's a pleasure for us today to count on your experienced voice.
Hi, Mar. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
And sitting next to her, I'm pleased to introduce you to András Földes. Did I say it all right?
Yeah,
Thank
exactly.
you. He's a journalist and video journalist focusing on humanitarian and ecological issues, and one of the founders of the Hungarian online news portal Telex.hu. He specialized on migration in 2015, and his reports covered the Balkan route as well as the Sahel route and the Mediterranean. Welcome, András. It's a pleasure for us to have you on board as well.
Thank you for the invitation. It was all true.
Thank you. The BBC. It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed. CBS News. This is in Iraq or Afghanistan. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European city. Al Jazeera. What's compelling is looking at them, the way they are dressed. These are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from the Middle East or North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to. Those are a statement from media outlets with worldwide audiences. As you have heard, some of them directly refer to the refugees from Ukraine as different, or the ones that we are used to. Are they really different? What are the differences between the crisis and previous ones? Why? The floor is yours, guys. Who wants to start?
Yeah, well...
András.
Thank you. Well, I have thought about this issue previously, especially because when I get back from my first trip from Ukraine, we arrived on the day of the war has started, and we stayed 10 days, and we've seen quite a lot. So when I came back, I described the same things to my friends and colleagues, that this situation has shocked me because I've seen people who could be my fellow citizens in such situation that couldn't be imaginable for me previously. And then I started to think and read about this issue because I felt this is strange
But
approach.
sorry to interrupt, but you were also covering other migration crises before, and you didn't have this feeling.
This is what I wanted to mention, that I witnessed the refugees fleeing the war in Mosul, for example, when the siege of Mosul had been going on, and in Libya, Niger, so different places. And then this feeling struck me, and I started to read some psychological papers. And one of those papers basically said that people can sympathize with those people who are closer to his cultural era or to his cultural complex, and this is a totally natural thing. So I wouldn't see it as a problem to speak out that I have more attached to this kind of tragedy than to those who flee from another culture, but I have to show the similarities, and then that's the game changer, to show like these people are the same refugees that we witnessed, for example, in 2015, and this is what I'm doing in my work nowadays, to show similarities and to show that if we react positively towards Ukrainians, why we shouldn't react the same way from people from other cultures, other continents, and this might be a way to build bridges actually to our readers, because if you alienate your readers, you just make them guilty. They will say after 1 or 2 or 3 articles that, okay, that's my feeling, and why you judge me? I feel sympathy to those people, and I feel less sympathy to those who wear, for example, different clothes, and I don't want to feel guilty. So they will not read your stuff, your pieces, and then your work will mean less. So my approach would be something like that.
I think that you pointed out like very interesting topic, that it's when you are acting as a citizen and when you're acting as a journalist. What I quote at the first, it was journalists saying and using these words to differentiate. So I think that maybe this is like 2 different topics. What do you think, May?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Like, I mean, András made the point that I guess when people are from, they're literally closer to you, like that they are on the same continent. So maybe you feel that you can kind of resonate with them a bit more, and you kind of feel closer to their trauma. So I think that is a natural feeling. It is important to kind of recognize that and to not kind of accuse people of something for feeling that way. But I guess, yeah, when it comes to reporting, it shouldn't change the way we report on things. It shouldn't mean that we are being far more sympathetic in our reporting to Ukrainians than we have been to Afghans or Syrians. And in the UK media, there has been a really stark difference in how this war has been reported on compared to, well, this refugee crisis has been reported on compared to previous ones. I mean, yeah, when there was the refugee sort of crisis in 2015, the UK media, had front pages using the terms like swarms of people are coming, it's an invasion. It was really quite dehumanizing, and kind of, it was reported on like it was a massive threat, whereas this Ukraine crisis has been far more humanizing, basically. And sort of, I'm talking more about the right-wing press in the UK, which has the most influence because it has the most readers. But yeah, the Ukraine crisis has been far more telling the stories of those coming across the border and how awful it is for them. And it's just been a really stark difference. And then on from that, the kind of government policy around it has also been incredibly different. I suppose with the UK, it's slightly different to Europe, because Europe actually is on the same continent as Ukraine. So actually people have been moving directly without, and also they've waived visas. But the UK has got a visa, because obviously we're not part of the EU anymore, there's not free movement. They've introduced a visa scheme for Ukrainians, which does have problems in itself, but it's far more generous than the schemes for the Syrians and the Afghans previously, and already it's welcomed far more people under those schemes. So I think that's when it becomes concerning, when there's a completely different treatment with different groups of refugees, and I don't think that's necessarily right.
You also pointed something out really interesting, I think, that how the narratives then affect the actually clear policies, and what's also like the problem between those, right? I don't know if we want to also discuss about it, because what is first, the narrative that leads to a policy or the policy that leads to a narrative? Ferruccio, the floor is yours.
What comes first? They are, I would say, they come together. They are co-constitutive. There is no policy without a narrative, and there is, and often narratives have consequences and are built to support policies. And indeed, there is a huge responsibility in concocting narratives for policies, as of course in making policies. But trying to be more concrete, I would like to go back with what May was saying about what this crisis is teaching us with regard to practical behaviors, to policies, to social behaviors, and to narratives. And indeed, I think there are 2 big lessons that are taught. One is that even though the arrivals are massive, unprecedented as this time, and very concentrated in time, receiving, hosting, and even welcoming very, very large and totally unexpected migration flows is possible. So it's something that can be made. I mean, within the scope of human possibility, especially for rich and advanced societies like ours. The second thing is that there is no determinism in how such events are told. We are, to some extent, capable to produce different narratives. There is nothing mechanic in how the media systems, for instance, react. Other crises, let's take Syria, for instance, the standard narrative was about masses, not about individuals. This time it's always the other way around. In other crises, there were no migrant voices. This time, luckily, there are, which is not to blame journalists who this time make it right, or citizens not to stigmatize citizens who feel closer, but to learn from this how to make it better next time.
That's a very interesting point. May, you have covered a lot of migration also, and in 2017, your work was recognized for that, right? So do you see this difference in the treatment that it's currently doing in Ukraine done, that your same treatment that you've done before in other crises, for example?
Yeah, definitely. There's a clear difference. I think in 2016, 2017, I was mainly focusing on migration from France to the UK. And I was looking a lot at actually unaccompanied children who were making that journey and also the journey kind of before they got to France. And they faced constant violence and also just setbacks, and the authorities constantly trying to stop them from getting past, and just no care at all. And there was this constant sense of disbelief, I guess, and this idea that people are just coming here to seek, for reasons that aren't to do with fleeing persecution, when that's just not the case. And it was really concerning. And so it's really interesting to see how different this is. And actually, it's true that in a way, it's hopeful, like you say, because we've seen that now people in Europe can welcome refugees and actually can do it in an incredibly, receptive way. So in the UK, more than 200,000 people have come forward to host Ukrainian refugees, and actually there's nowhere near that number of Ukrainians who have come to the UK at this point. So the question now is, I think, whether those people offering to host Ukrainians will actually say, well, okay, maybe I'll take in some Afghans. And we've got lots of Afghan refugees stuck in hotels at the moment, Afghan families who were evacuated from Kabul in August. And I think it will be really interesting to see whether that actually, we can extend that welcome to other refugees. And hopefully, people, the public will be up for that because, it would be great if actually this can be seen as an opportunity to welcome more people.
You made a very good point, to actually introduce the second part of the podcast.
There's no humanity or compassion in calling for unlimited, safe and legal routes.
No es lo mismo la inmigración procedente de los países islámicos que la inmigración procedente de países hispanoamericanos que tienen una misma cultura, una misma forma de entender el mundo a la que tenemos.
Il faut interrompre les flux migratoires, les confiner à zéro. Comme ça, il n'y aura plus de pression des derniers arrivants qui vont culpabiliser les plus anciens parce qu'ils adoptent les normes.
Economic migrants taking advantage of the asylum system will not get to stay in the UK.
Ninguno de los menas que roban, que agreden o que violan en la Casa de Campo de Madrid o en el resto de las ciudades españolas han venido a aportar nada a España, señorías.
On connaît le vieil adage, à Rome, fais comme les Romains. Eh bien, à Paris, fais comme les Parisiens. À Troyes, fais comme les Troyens. En France, fais comme les Français. On ne s'habille pas avec des vêtements qui datent du 7e siècle en Arabie Saoudite. On ne met pas de burkini, on ne met pas de djellaba, on ne met pas de voile en France.
As we all know, migration has been used in political debates all over Europe to gain political leverage and eventually votes. The last French elections are a good example, but is far from the only one. Radical right-wing parties have gained support in many different countries in Europe and indeed have become part of the political landscape. it has become somewhat normal to hear speeches of selected representatives who position themselves against the defense of basic human rights. How did that happen? Why is migration such a polarizing issue in European political debates? Of course, to reply to this question, I have to give the floor to András, my colleague from Hungary, which, we all know that Hungary is a different situation. So please give your opinion on that, or what do you think is happening and why?
Yeah, well, it's a very complex issue in Hungary because the government built a whole media structure, and the government dominates like 70-80% of the media and runs constant propaganda against migrants. So this really have a hard effect, a strong effect on the public, and then they can use it later on. However, now the Ukrainian situation made an interesting turn on this policy, because this right-wing, or I would rather say ultra-right-wing party, Fidesz, that forms the government, realized that at the situation of the war, we cannot stand out so much anymore from the European perspective. They still vetoing, a lot of European sanctions, but because Fidesz has lost all its allies in Eastern Europe, they try to make that nice dance moves towards, for example, Poland, that used to be a close alliance of Hungary, and that's why they at least try to be nice with the Ukrainian refugees. But still, we have our old legislative towards all the other refugees. So it's a very strange situation when you have people with brown skin running from war, and they got beaten up and thrown back to another country, and we have white color people with white skin coming from another war, and we welcome them in some ways.
That was actually a little bit what May was saying before, right? Like the difference that of the policies through the migrants, or where do they come from? But my question is, how can we change that as journalists? Like, does the narrative of those migration has an affection of it? And also, how can we deal with the impunity of these governments to just, apply one law in one kind of refugees, but also don't apply the same law in this other kind of refugees?
Yeah, well, let me just give you a very short answer, and then I give you May the word. In Hungary, as I mentioned, Hungary is a very special situation. So the media, the free media, the independent media is in grave danger. So our concern is not how to change the policy, but how to survive and keep on publishing news.
Yeah, it's really concerning to hear about what's happening in Hungary, and unfortunately, other parts of Europe that they're not as extreme, but similarly concerning issues going on. I think. Speaking about the UK, migration has definitely been used as a bit of a political weapon, I think, and actually that's been going on for quite a long time now. But I feel like it's getting worse and worse. So politicians kind of jumping on the issue as a way to try and appeal to voters. But then in doing so, they talk about how terrible the issue is and how all these illegal migrants are, in inverted quotes, are coming to the UK. But then that kind of fuels the issue, because then the public thinks, oh God, it is a big issue. And then they start to I think that makes the public more concerned than they should be. And actually it makes it look like a bigger issue than it really is. When you actually look at the numbers, particularly with the UK, we don't, there aren't that many people coming to the UK. And recently it has become a bit more of a prominent issue, because more like asylum seekers, people are trying to get to the UK on small boats via the Channel, whereas they used to more take the routes, like more kind of clandestine routes, like in lorries, or kind of stowing away in ferries and so on. So it's just more visible now, and there's all these pictures in the media of these small boats with lots of people in them, but it's just so dehumanizing, and they're put alongside headlines, as I said, to do sort of using terms like invasion and things like that. So that's really concerning. But yeah, I think unfortunately, our current government is trying to appease to voters. we did have a far-right party, UKIP, that actually got very close to, well, they won a lot more votes than they were expected to win a few years ago. And I think this current government is now like, oh, we need to make sure we're appealing to those voters so they don't turn to another party like UKIP. But I just don't think it works, because I think actually by doing that, they create this sense that there is a massive problem when actually there isn't a massive problem. And then that puts them under more pressure to do something about it. So they've almost created this sense that there's a huge issue when there really isn't.
Ferruccio, do you want to add something on that?
Yeah, maybe we could add that the migration as an issue doesn't always have the same degree of salience. I mean, it's not just as mechanic as this. We have seen it, for instance, during at the height of the pandemic, where all polls showed that migration had lost ground as a priority in the heart of the people. You know? There were other more pressing issues. The same during the Great Recession last decade in Southern Europe. People realized that what they thought was the main threat was actually not the main threat, and there were much more pressing issues. So there are moments, and often these are moments of socioeconomic crisis that have nothing to do with migration, where moments of lucidity, where people are able to re-establish a correct scale of priorities. But in other moments, strategies of exploitation of migration as a tool to build consensus find more ground. And of course, it's important as journalists and as researchers to help, create antidotes to this kind of exploitation.
So then my question here is, how do we inform about migration if we have to put a lot of efforts on that, or maybe, as you were saying now, wouldn't be that important topic as we are giving this importance. So how do we tell the world about migration in terms of journalists, but also research? May.
Yeah, I mean, I think as journalists we need to sort of scrutinise what politicians are saying more. A lot of reporting in the UK is kind of towing the government line, or they put out a press release and it's yeah, let's go with that line, and there's not enough. Actually, let's look at what policy they're introducing and actually how this will work in practice. Is it realistic? Is it workable? How much is it going to cost? So I'm thinking specifically about the recently announced plan to send people coming to claim asylum in the UK to Rwanda for processing there. And the government announced it recently, and it got loads of airtime, which obviously, it was big news, but there hasn't been nearly enough scrutinising actually what the plan is and how it's going to work. And it's just kind of an acceptance that, yeah, this is what's happening, and it's because there's this huge issue and we need to resolve it. So I think, yeah, it's about really kind of checking, the accuracy of what's being said, but also balancing the reporting. Don't just listen to what the people in power are saying. Go onto the ground, speak to refugees and asylum seekers, speak to the people making these journeys, and go to both sides of the border. Don't just focus on the border. Go and see people who are trying to get across the border and people who have got across the border and what's happening to them afterwards. And find out what the reality is on the ground. And also speaking to kind of lawyers and charities in the area, I think that's always a really valuable thing to do, because they often have a more realistic view of what's really going on than sometimes what the governments are trying to convey in what they're putting out.
Do you want to add something, András? Short, please?
Yeah, very shortly. So maybe it's going to be a little bit of provocative from a researcher's point of view, but I think newsworthiness is very important for a journalist. So I choose topic when it's happening and people are interested of. But as May mentioned, we have the liberty to choose methods to report on situation. So what I do is I report from the ground, and I do complex stories. I mentioned previously that when I went to Libya, because of there was this phenomenon of slavery, I report about this, but also I interviewed people why they flee from their country to Libya. And my report concluded about the policy of Frontex, of European Union, how they founded the Libyan Coast Guard, and what kind of abuses this organization makes towards refugees. So it became a complex story, and that gives more than just, one flashy news about slavery, or it gave. Hopefully.
Yes, I think that what we all agree here is that narrating migration is not easy. It's complex. There are different ways of doing it, and all of them lead to, of course, also different policies. It's a really interesting debate. We could be here for hours, but of course we are running out of time as usual. So I will just give you the floor for, if you can, the three of you, summarize in 1 minute, answering the question of what can we do at the moment where we are now. Ferruccio, your turn.
Yeah, maybe I would like to stress that migration is an important issue, a very important issue, and as a researcher, I decided to focus mainly on that. But I see Europe is obsessed by migration. So there is a migration obsession that is definitely something wrong. We should, as also May was saying, rebalance the agenda in politics, in media, maybe also in research. Migration is sometimes, as it is often said, used as a weapon of mass distraction. Right? So to distract from other more or equally pressing issues, people are often lured into fear migration, whereas probably there are other trends, phenomena, issues that are, to be feared, linked, for instance, to environmental crisis. And so the final message, let's keep the balance at all levels and from all points of view in dealing with migration.
Thank you very much, Ferruccio. May?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about migration being used as a distraction. And politicians can use it as a distraction from other, actually more pressing issues and, to take the attention off areas that they wouldn't want people to be looking at. But I think, as journalists, we shouldn't step away from covering it for that reason. It's still an incredibly big issue that's affecting lots of people. And what we need to really do is just dig into the issues more. Like it should be about more investigative journalism rather than just covering the events then and there, like on the day, going to the border, covering an event and then walking away. It should be about actually, let's dig into this. What isn't being reported on? What are the governments not wanting us to report on, and actually do more of that. Obviously it takes more time and more resource, but I really think it's worth journalists trying to push to do that. And I think that's the way that we can try to start changing the narrative.
Thank you very much, May. András?
Yeah, I would just join shortly to these thoughts. I totally agree with May, and I would just add that a balanced journalism is very important. Not to be activist, to be as factual as possible. I think that's very important. So not to take part in the political debate, but report on the situation. That would be a guideline for me.
Thank you very much. That was András Földes, journalism journalist from Telex.hu, May Bulman, social affairs correspondent at The Independent, and Ferruccio Pastore, BRIDGES scientific co-coordinator and director of FIERI. Thank you very much for joining us today on the first podcast of the BRIDGES projects, where we tried to shed some light on a topic that cannot be more up to date: the narratives on migration.
This program is part of the BRIDGES podcast series, produced by the Barcelona Centre for International Affairs and funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 program.